My name is Anya Sterling. I am 42 years old. For 2 decades, I served as an intelligence analyst in the U.S. Navy, a life lived in quiet, windowless rooms, piecing together whispers and shadows from across the globe. My world was one of encrypted signals and satellite maps, a place where I translated chaos into clarity to keep ships safe on unseen horizons. It was a life of purpose, but also one of distance, a slow, steady drift from the shores of the life I'd left behind in the misty, pine-scented town of Port Blossom, Washington. I've held the weight of classified knowledge, but the heaviest secret I ever had to carry was my own, and the deepest betrayal I ever faced wasn't from an enemy of the state. It came from the people who had built my world, only to tear it down, my family. And it all came to a head in a place I never imagined I'd be: a defendant, a courtroom. The memory of that morning is etched into me like scrimshaw on old ivory. My mother, her hands clutching a string of pearls I'd bought her from a port in Japan, her face a mask of sorrow that didn't quite reach her eyes. My father, his posture ramrod straight, a silent, stoic statue of disappointment. And my younger brother, Leo, with his wife, Claire, beside him. Leo, the golden child, the one who stayed, his face a carefully constructed portrait of a man wronged. Claire, her hand resting on his arm, her expression one of practiced, syrupy concern. Faces I had loved, faces I had missed across oceans and continents, now looked at me as if I were a stranger, an intruder in the story of their lives. Their lawyer, a man with a sharp suit and an even sharper tongue, painted me as a phantom limb of the family long since severed, but still causing pain. They claimed my years of service, the very thing I believed was my contribution to a world larger than myself, had left me emotionally barren, unstable, and greedy. They said I had returned from my duties not as a daughter or a sister, but as a predator, using my authority to manipulate my aging parents. They demanded everything: the cedar-shingled house overlooking the Puget Sound, the home where the scent of my mother's roses still clung to my memories, the small portfolio of investments I had meticulously built with every spare dollar from my salary. And, most painfully, they demanded the narrative. They wanted to strip me of my place in our family's history, recasting me as the villain in a story I didn't even know was being written. I stood in my dress uniform, the fabric crisp, the metals on my chest feeling impossibly heavy. I listened as my own mother testified that I had become distant and unpredictable. I watched my father nod in solemn agreement, his gaze fixed on a point just over my shoulder. And I watched Leo and Claire, a united front of manufactured grief. For the longest time, I let the silence be my only defense. I let their words hang in the sterile air of the courtroom. I let them build their cage of lies around me, because I had learned in my years of service that the first report is rarely the whole truth. My objective wasn't to win their approval or the court's sympathy. It was to honor the truth, a principle I had dedicated my life to. So when my moment finally came, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't offer a rebuttal filled with anger or pain. I simply reached into the leather satchel at my side and pulled out a single, folded sheet of paper. I walked toward the judge's bench, my footsteps soft but sure on the polished floor. The silence in the room was absolute, a held breath. I placed the paper before him. I met his tired eyes and spoke, my voice low but clear. Your Honor, with all due respect to the proceedings, I believe this document will provide the necessary context before any ruling is made. He picked it up, his expression one of weary patience. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the first few lines. I saw the change immediately. It wasn't a dramatic gasp, but a subtle, powerful shift. His posture straightened. His gaze sharpened, moving from curiosity to intense focus, and then to a dawning, grim understanding. He read it a second time, his lips a thin, hard line. He set the paper down, but he didn't look at me or my family. He looked at the bailiff standing by the door. Lock the doors, he commanded, his voice devoid of its earlier weariness, now sharp and authoritative. No one leaves this room. A ripple of confusion went through the courtroom. My mother's hand flew to her throat. Leo, who had been looking confident, froze, a flicker of panic in his eyes. Claire whispered his name, her voice a frantic hiss. And then, through a side door, two men in dark, conservative suits entered. They weren't courtroom officials. They were federal agents. They moved with a quiet, unnerving purpose. The carefully constructed drama of the courtroom dissolved into raw, chaotic reality. There were no shouts, just staggered gasps, the scraping of chairs, and then the soft, final click of handcuffs. I remained standing, a silent observer as the life my brother had built on a foundation of lies was dismantled before my eyes. I could have fought them with words long before this. I could have screamed and cried and accused. But my training wasn't in loud confrontations, it was in the patient accumulation of facts, in understanding the whole map before making a single move. While they were playing a small, cruel game of family politics, I was uncovering something far more insidious. They thought they were simply taking what they believed was theirs. They never understood that their greed had led them into waters so deep and dangerous, they were destined to drown. As the judge ordered their arrest and my family sat in stunned, broken silence, I felt no surge of victory, no satisfying sting of revenge. There was only a profound, aching quiet inside me. A quiet certainty. I had learned long ago that the most significant battles aren't always fought with weapons on foreign shores. Sometimes, they are fought in hushed rooms, under the hum of fluorescent lights, with the weight of a lifetime pressing down on you. This quiet courtroom was my battlefield. And the war had been won long before this day. The paper on the judge's desk was not just a piece of evidence. It was the final word in a long, silent conversation I had been having with myself, a culmination of quiet endurance, patient investigation, and the steadfast refusal to let their betrayal define me. They had called me broken. They had tried to take everything. But a single sheet of paper, representing a single, undeniable truth, was all it took to reclaim my own story. And as those courtroom doors locked, their fate, like their lies, was sealed. The first tremor of the earthquake that would shatter my life came on a quiet Tuesday morning, cloaked in the mundane. The sky outside my small, rented cottage in Port Blossom was the color of a dove's wing, a soft, persistent gray that promised rain. I was at the old oak table in my kitchen, a relic from my parents' house that I'd claimed years ago, nursing a cup of tea and watching the mist curl over the Puget Sound. An email pinged in my inbox. The subject line read, "Application processed, Patriot Guardian Fund." I frowned. I hadn't applied for any aid. My naval pension was modest, but more than sufficient. My needs were simple. I had my cottage, my books, and the endless, soothing rhythm of the tide. I assumed it was spam, a sophisticated phishing attempt targeting veterans. But something made me open it. The email contained my full name, Anya Sterling. It listed my service number and the dates of my last overseas deployment, information that wasn't public. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I carefully clicked the link, my analyst instincts taking over. The page that loaded showed a completed application for financial assistance due to hardship and personal distress. The amount, a staggering $50,000, had already been disbursed to a bank account I had never seen before. I closed the laptop, my hands perfectly steady, a discipline honed by years of handling sensitive intelligence. But inside, a hairline fracture was spreading through the foundation of my world. That afternoon, I made a call to an old contact from my days at the Pentagon, a man who owed me a favor and who could navigate the labyrinth of federal financial systems. "Just a loose thread I need pulled, Mark," I said, keeping my voice light. The thread, when he pulled it, unraveled everything. It took him less than an hour to confirm my fears, and then unearth ones I hadn't even conceived of. The cedar-shingled house on the bluff, the one my father built and my mother filled with flowers, the one that was supposed to be left to both Leo and me, had been used as collateral for a massive business loan. The loan was in the name of a corporation I'd never heard of, North Star Legacy Ventures. The company had been founded 2 years ago. Its CEO was my brother, Leo Sterling. That night, surrounded by the familiar scent of salt and rain, I sat with a stack of documents Mark had emailed me. The only light was the glow of my screen, painting shadows on the walls of the room that had been my sanctuary. I saw the timeline of transactions, the legal maneuvers, the way my name had been methodically erased from the trust and deed records, like a ghost being scrubbed from a photograph. Then I saw it, a small, almost elegant detail on a scanned signature page. Next to my father's trembling signature was a tiny, distinctive flourish, a stylized star. It was the same mark Leo used to make when he was practicing the signature for his brand, a habit I'd teased him about at our last family Christmas. He just started Northstar then, full of talk about building an empire. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house. The rose bushes my mother had tended for 40 years were in full, glorious bloom, their scent a sweet, painful reminder of a life that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. I found them in the sunroom. Leo was on his phone, looking pleased with himself. Claire was arranging a bouquet of my mother's roses in a vase, a picture of domestic grace. I held up the printed deed transfer. I kept my voice quiet, even. Can someone explain this to me? Leo glanced up, his expression barely shifting from boredom. It's just business, Anya. Mom and Dad are investors. It's all above board. My mother's gaze flickered nervously to my father, who cleared his throat and stared out at the water. My name is gone, Leo, I pressed, my voice still quiet. The trust was meant for both of us. Why wasn't I told? He shrugged, a gesture of dismissal that was more wounding than any shout. You're never here. You have your own life. We were just restructuring things to be more efficient. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. Restructuring? Is that what you call it? Claire turned from the roses, her smile perfectly polished. Anya, darling, you've been through so much. We didn't want to worry you. Leo is just trying to secure the family's future. It's for the best. The family. The words hung in the air, creating a wall between us. I looked at my mother, her hands twisting the pearls at her neck. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I tried one last time, my voice barely a whisper. Mom? Did you know about this? She looked at her hands. Leo explained it all, she murmured. He knows best about these things. Something inside me didn't just crack, it turned to dust. I nodded slowly, a single, final acknowledgement of the truth. I turned and walked out of the room. This time, I didn't expect anyone to follow, and they didn't. In the hallway, I passed a framed photo of Leo and me as children, building a sandcastle on the beach below the house, our arms around each other, smiling at a future we thought we would share. I drove back to my cottage as the afternoon rain began to fall, the wipers beating a slow, mournful rhythm against the glass. I understood then. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. They had chosen a side, and it wasn't mine. They had told me, in their own quiet way, exactly where I stood, on the outside, looking in. The lawsuit arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by a courier. The envelope was heavy, cream-colored, embossed with a tasteful, lawyerly crest. It felt cold in my hands. The words inside were a formal declaration of war, dressed in the polite, brutal language of the law. Plaintiff: Leo Sterling. Defendant: Anya Sterling. The claims were a litany of betrayals I had supposedly committed, undue influence over our parents, misappropriation of family funds, causing emotional distress. Emotional distress. The irony was a physical blow. A cold wave washed over me, and for a moment, the room tilted. My hands did not shake, a lifetime of discipline held them steady, but deep inside, a fragile part of me, the part that had held on to the idea of home, collapsed. I had navigated geopolitical crises, faced down threats that could destabilize nations, but this felt different. This was an attack from within the walls of my own heart. I wasn't being challenged by an adversary. I was being systematically erased by my own family. The story was fed to the Port Blossom Beacon by noon, and by evening, it had been picked up by a Seattle news affiliate. Decorated naval officer sued by family amid accusations of financial abuse. Family claims veteran exploited aging parents. The photo they used was my official military portrait, my expression severe, my eyes looking straight ahead. It was the face of a stranger, a cold and distant woman I didn't recognize. The phone calls began, tentative and awkward, from friends who had heard the news. Their voices were strained with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Then, just as quickly, the calls stopped. The silence that followed was more deafening than any headline. I tried to go to the Salty Mug Cafe, my usual spot for coffee and solitude, but I felt the eyes on me. The waitress, a kind woman who usually greeted me with a warm smile, suddenly couldn't meet my gaze. I saw her glance from me to the television mounted in the corner, where a local news anchor was discussing the troubling case. I left before my coffee arrived. I retreated into myself. I didn't issue a statement. I didn't defend myself. My training had taught me that in an information war, the first casualty is nuance. The quickest way to lose is to react without a strategy. But in the quiet of my cottage, the betrayal was a living thing. It sat with me in the evenings, a cold, heavy presence that the warmth of my fireplace couldn't touch. An email from my commanding officer arrived, politely suggesting I take an extended administrative leave to resolve my personal affairs. The subtext was clear. I had become a complication. I accepted without protest. I needed the time. The days that followed were a blur of legal documents and sleepless nights. I read through decades of financial records, trust agreements, and bank statements. Leo's narrative was a masterpiece of fiction. He claimed I had used my brief leaves from deployment to pressure our parents, leveraging my military rank to intimidate them into giving me control of their finances. The language was calculated to wound, twisting my service into a weapon. I could have driven back to the house on the bluff. I could have screamed at them, demanded they look me in the eye and tell me why. But I didn't. Instead, I sat with the quiet. I let the storm of public opinion rage outside my windows. And I began to think. I thought about the subtle shifts in my mother's letters over the years, the way her pride in my career had slowly been replaced by a gentle, chiding concern for my absence. I thought about Leo's casual envy, the jokes he made about me escaping while he was stuck at home. I thought about all the times I had come back to Port Blossom, expecting to step back into a life that had, in my absence, moved on without me. I came to a slow, painful realization. Home, as I remembered it, no longer existed. This wasn't a fight to reclaim my family. It was a fight to reclaim my truth. And that distinction made all the difference. So I remained silent. I didn't feed the gossip. I didn't try to clear my name. Because I was beginning to understand that the most powerful response isn't always an action. Sometimes it is the quiet, deliberate act of holding your ground and waiting for the truth to find its own voice. I can't pinpoint the exact moment when the quiet hum of suspicion in my heart grew into the roaring certainty of truth. Perhaps it was in the subtle, practiced way Claire would steer conversations away from North Star Legacy Ventures whenever I asked a direct question. Or in the way Leo's eyes would dart away, a flicker of something that looked like fear whenever I mentioned finances. Or maybe it was simply that my mind, trained for 2 decades to find the pattern in the noise, couldn't ignore the dissonance any longer. For a while, I was terrified that I was the one who was broken, that years of living in a world of high-stakes secrets had made me see threats where there were only shadows. But these were not shadows. They were real, and they had substance. The first thread I pulled was small, an anomalous entry in a publicly available business ledger. North Star Legacy Ventures had received a consulting fee from a small nonprofit called Serene Path. At first, it seemed innocuous. But I remembered the name. Serene Path was the wellness consultancy Claire had started a few years back, her supposed passion project. From the quiet sanctuary of my cottage, with the rhythmic crash of waves as my only soundtrack, I began to do what I did best. I traced the data. Night after night, the glow of my laptop was the only light, my fingers flying across the keyboard with a precision that felt like coming home. The methods were the same I'd used to track dark money funding insurgent groups, only this time, the target was my own family. What I found made the cold air of the Pacific Northwest feel even colder. Serene Path was more than a wellness consultancy, it was a front. It was receiving grants from a dozen different obscure veterans charities. In return, Serene Path was supposedly providing transitional counseling to recently discharged service members. The patient list was filled with real names, men and women whose service records I could access through my own channels. But when I cross-referenced the dates, a chilling pattern emerged. Most of the grants were dispersed while these veterans were still on active duty overseas, unaware that their names were being used. They weren't just taking money, they were stealing identities. They were exploiting the sacred trust of military service to create ghost profiles, applying for aid, and then laundering the money through Leo's company. It was a sick, ingenious scheme. And the most heartbreaking part? My parents' signatures were on the grant applications as character references, their good names used to legitimize the fraud. I wanted to believe they were victims, too, that they had been tricked. But the transactions were too numerous, the signatures too consistent. The dates aligned perfectly with every visit Leo and Claire had made to their home. I leaned back in my chair, the room feeling small and airless. The doubt returned, a venomous whisper. Was I inventing this? Had I become so conditioned to see conspiracy that I was creating one out of grief and confusion? I could almost hear my mother's gentle voice. Anya, dear, not every shadow holds a monster. I wanted so desperately to believe her. But then I remembered the stylized star next to my father's signature. It was a small act of hubris, a tiny, careless mistake made by someone who believed they were too clever to be caught. They thought I was too distant, too distracted by my own life to ever look closely enough. But they had forgotten what my life had trained me to do. I always look. The pieces began to lock into place, forming a picture that was darker than I could have imagined. This wasn't just family greed. This was methodical, organized crime, preying on the most vulnerable. And the people I loved were at the heart of it. I still couldn't prove it conclusively, not in a way that would stand up in court. And that kernel of self-doubt remained, a constant, nagging fear that I was chasing phantoms of my own making. But I couldn't stop. If I was wrong, I needed to know. And if I was right, this was no longer about my family shame. It was about a betrayal that went far beyond the walls of our home. There is a particular kind of loneliness that settles in when the world quietly turns its back on you. It's not a sudden slam of a door, but a gradual fading of familiar voices. The weekly check-in calls from old Navy buddies dwindled to silence. The invitations to local Port Blossom gatherings stopped appearing in my mailbox. People I had known my whole life, who had watched me grow up, now crossed the street to avoid me at the Harborview Market. Even my former commanding officer, a man who had once called me his best analyst, now spoke to me with a careful, measured tone. Maybe you just need a break from it all, Anya, he'd said on our last call. The pressure gets to everyone eventually. He was giving me an out, a narrative that would explain away my family's accusations as a symptom of burnout. I told him I was fine, but the truth was I was adrift in a sea of isolation. I had been alone in remote outposts, surrounded by nothing but sand and stars, but that was a physical solitude. This was a soul-deep loneliness, the kind that whispers that you are fundamentally unworthy of connection. And still, I held my peace. Because beneath the crushing weight of despair, a different feeling was beginning to stir, a quiet, insistent hum of intuition. It was the feeling I'd get just before an intelligence breakthrough, the sense of a hidden thread just waiting to be pulled. So, I began to pull. I used old, encrypted channels to contact a few trusted former colleagues, people who operated in the same shadowy world I had. I didn't ask for official help, I asked for favors. Just look at this for me, will you? See if it feels right. Night after night, I worked in the dark, the cottage silent around me, the only sound the clatter of my own keys. More than once, I felt despair wash over me. I'd catch myself whispering to the empty room, what if they're right? What if I'm the one who's lost her way? But the data was a loyal companion. It didn't have emotions. It didn't lie. And it was starting to tell a story. I found a transaction that didn't fit the pattern, a payment from Northstar Legacy Ventures not to a domestic account, but to an offshore holding company. The name was innocuous, but the routing bank was one I recognized from a classified briefing years ago. It was a known channel for laundering money for a powerful European syndicate, the Ethelred Consortium. They didn't just deal in money, they dealt in information, specializing in industrial and military espionage. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something other than grief. It wasn't triumph, not yet. It was the cold, clear oxygen of validation. My pulse, which had been a frantic drum of anxiety, steadied. The fog in my mind began to clear. I wasn't broken. I wasn't imagining things. This was real. And I was the only one who could see the whole picture. That tiny flicker of certainty was enough. It was the spar I clung to in the wreckage. I started sleeping again, even if only for a few hours at a time. I started eating, tasting my food for the first time in months. I started to remember who I was before all this, a woman trained to find the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. They had tried to take my name, my home, my reputation, but they hadn't taken my mind. And that, I decided, would be enough. I knew the battle ahead would be the hardest of my life. But for the first time since that email had arrived, I felt my feet on solid ground. In the quiet of my cottage by the sea, I made a promise to myself. I would not let this story end in their fabricated narrative. I would see it through to its true conclusion. It had to end where it began, in the cedar-shingled house on the bluff, a place that held the ghosts of every version of myself I had ever been. I asked my parents to meet me there alone. When I walked through the familiar front door, the scent of lemon oil and old books was a punch to the gut. They were in the living room, silhouetted against the large picture window that looked out over the gray, churning waters of the Sound. My mother sat on the edge of the sofa, her posture rigid. My father stood by the window, his arms crossed, a sentinel guarding a broken kingdom. I placed a single, thin folder on the polished surface of the coffee table between us. They both looked at it but made no move to touch it. "I know," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the still room. "I know about North Star and Serene Path. I know about the stolen identities of the veterans. And I know where the money has been going." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. "I know about the Ethelred Consortium." At the name, my mother flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor. My father's stoic expression finally cracked, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second before the mask slipped back into place. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm not here to argue," I replied, my heart aching with a grief so profound it felt like a physical illness. "I'm here to ask you one thing." "Why?" They looked at each other then, a long, silent conversation passing between them in a single glance. It was my mother who finally spoke, her voice thin and brittle as a dried leaf. "You always had your own life, Anya," she began. "You were always leaving. The Navy, your deployments. You built a whole world without us." She looked down at her hands, twisting a handkerchief. Leo was here. He needed us." I stared at her, the simple, devastating logic of her words knocking the air from my lungs. "Needed you? Mom, he used you. He used your names, your home, everything this family stood for, to commit fraud." My voice broke on the last word, a betrayal of the calm I was trying so desperately to maintain. My father turned from the window, his face etched with a weary resignation. "It's not that simple," he said. "He was trying to build something. To be someone. We wanted to help our son." He finally looked at me, and his gaze was heavy with a lifetime of unspoken things. "Sometimes you have to choose the child who stays." The words landed not like a slap, but like a quiet, final closing of a door I hadn't even realized was still open. I stood there, motionless, as a slideshow of memories flickered through my mind, every missed birthday, every holiday spent on deployment, every time I had chosen my duty over a trip home, believing they understood. I had thought my absence was a sacrifice for a greater good. They had seen it as an abandonment. In that moment, I understood that I had lost them long before the fraud, long before the lawsuit. I had lost them incrementally, in 1,000 small, quiet goodbyes they had made in their hearts while I was away. This wasn't about money. It was about presence. And I had not been present. I took a slow breath, the air in the room thick with the ghosts of what might have been. "Family isn't an obligation," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's not about who stays and who goes. It's a choice you make every day, to love and respect each other." I looked from my mother's tear-streaked face to my father's shuttered one. "I never stopped choosing you. But you stopped choosing me." The silence that followed was profound and absolute. It was the silence of an ending. I picked up the folder from the table. I have to see this through, I told them, my voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. Not for revenge. For the people they hurt. And for myself. I walked to the door, my heart a hollow drum in my chest. I paused with my hand on the knob, not looking back. A family is something you protect, I whispered to the empty hallway. Not something you sell. Then I walked out into the misty afternoon, leaving the house of my childhood behind for the last time. The tears came then, hot and silent, but I didn't stop walking. I had a truth to honor, and I was the only one left to do it. The day of the hearing, the sky over Port Blossom was a canvas of bruised purple and gray. I dressed in my formal service uniform, the dark blue a familiar comfort. It wasn't a costume for the court, it was my skin, a testament to the life I had chosen, the identity I had earned. The courtroom was small and impersonal, its pale wood and fluorescent lights a sterile backdrop for the messy, heartbreaking drama about to unfold. My family was already there. Leo looked pale but defiant. Claire sat beside him, a study in composed sorrow. My parents sat in the front row, looking small and lost. When their lawyer began to speak, her voice a smooth, persuasive river of falsehoods, I felt a strange sense of detachment. She painted me as a cold, ambitious woman, alienated by the horrors of war, who had come home to prey on her loving family. She twisted my service into a pathology, my independence into a character flaw. I listened. I did not react. I thought of my training, of the long hours spent learning to separate signal from noise, fact from emotion. This was all noise. Even when Claire took the stand, her voice trembling as she spoke of her fears for my mental state, I remained still. Her performance was flawless, a masterclass in weaponized concern. And then it was my turn. I rose and addressed the judge, my voice calm and steady. Your Honor, I am not here to defend my character. My service record speaks for itself. I am here to provide clarity. I walked to the bench and laid down the single sheet of paper. It was a summary, a simple flowchart I had created myself. It showed the flow of money, from the Veterans Charities to Serene Path, from Serene Path to North Star Legacy Ventures, and from there, a single, damning line connecting it to a numbered account at a bank known to be a subsidiary of the Ethelred Consortium. The judge read it, and I watched his expression shift from professional interest to sharp, focused alarm. He knew the name. Ethelred was on federal watch lists. This was no longer a simple family dispute over inheritance. Lock the doors, he ordered. The arrival of the federal agents was swift and silent. The polished veneer of the courtroom shattered. As the agents approached their table, Leo's face contorted, not with guilt, but with the impotent rage of a man who had been outmaneuvered. Claire dissolved into frantic, disbelieving sobs. This is a mistake, she cried. This is all a terrible mistake. The judge read the charges: financial fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, and operating as an unregistered agent for a foreign entity. My parents watched, their faces ashen, as if they were watching a play from a great distance. As the agents led Leo away, his eyes met mine. There was no hatred in them, only a vast, hollow bewilderment. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he whispered, a boyish complaint from a man who had caused irreparable harm. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving only me and my parents in the heavy silence. I walked over to them. For the first time, they looked their age, fragile and worn down by choices they couldn't undo. You should go home, I said softly. My mother looked up at me, a single tear tracing a path through her makeup. We were just trying to help him, she whispered, her voice ragged. We were so afraid of losing him, too. And in that moment, I understood. Their betrayal wasn't born of malice, but of a desperate, misguided love, a fear of being left behind by both their children. They had clung so tightly to the son who stayed that they had enabled his destruction. I didn't offer forgiveness. I didn't offer comfort. There were no words for the vast, sorrowful expanse between us. I simply nodded, turned, and walked away. In the weeks that followed, the story became a national sensation. I was alternately hailed as a hero and condemned as a monster who had destroyed her own family. I ignored it all. I retreated to my cottage, to the steady rhythm of the tides and the quiet company of my own thoughts. The U.S. Attorney's Office announced that due to their age and frail health, my parents would not face prosecution. The public outcry was immediate, but I remained silent. Their fate was no longer my burden to carry. One morning, months later, a letter arrived. It was from a young sailor whose identity had been stolen in the scheme. The Sentinel Fund, a small, anonymous foundation I had established with the recovered assets, had helped him clear his name and restore his credit. "I thought no one was in my corner," he wrote. "Thank you for fighting for those of us who can't." I held the letter to my chest, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the triumphant peace of a battle won, but the quiet, gentle peace of a purpose found. This morning I stood on the beach as the sun rose over the Sound, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of salt and possibility. I thought of my family, not with anger, but with a deep, quiet sorrow for all that had been broken. I had learned that some wounds don't ever fully heal, but they can transform. They can become a source of strength, a reminder of the lines you will not cross, the person you will choose to be. You learn in the service that you can't choose your battles, but you can choose how you fight them. My war wasn't fought in a courtroom or in the headlines. It was fought in the quiet chambers of my own heart. It was a fight for self-respect, for the integrity of my own story. The ocean stretched before me, endless and calm. The tide was coming in, washing the shore clean. I took a deep breath, letting the stillness fill me, not as armor, but as grace. And I knew, with a certainty that resonated deeper than any pain, that I was finally home.